Robert Miller sat on the porch of his house, his eyes lost in the distance as the trees swayed gently in the breeze. The sun was setting, casting a warm orange and gold hue across the sky, reflecting off the vast fields he had tended for most of his life. Every inch of that land told a story, the sacrifices he and his late wife made to keep it, the laughter of his sons running through the fields, and the hard days spent under the scorching sun. But that evening felt different. The voices of Anthony and Samuel, his sons, filled the porch. Their tone, firm and unyielding, cut through the air like a sharp blade. "Dad, you have to understand. Selling the farm is what's best for everyone," insisted Anthony, the eldest. His expression was serious, his eyes locked onto Robert's, as if he were trying to convey a truth he barely believed himself. Robert felt a tightness in his chest. His rough, calloused fingers trembled slightly as he gripped his cane. He looked at his son, but couldn't see the boy who used to play with toy cars in the living room. Instead, he saw a man consumed with numbers and profits. "It's not about the money," Robert muttered, his voice low and shaky. "This farm, it's all I have left. It's what keeps us connected as a family." Samuel, the younger son, shifted uncomfortably, his voice hesitant as he tried to speak. "Dad, we know how much this place means to you. But you can't take care of it alone anymore. And we have our own lives to manage too." Anthony jumped in, his voice practical, almost rehearsed. "Plus, think about your health, Dad. Moving somewhere you can be taken care of, where you have comfort. Wouldn't that be better? You shouldn't be out here by yourself, dealing with all this." Robert looked into his sons' faces, searching for some trace of the boys he and his wife had raised with so much love. But all he saw were distant men, focused only on the financial aspect of everything he held dear. Words seemed to escape him, but he found the strength to say, You want me to leave it all behind for what? A bit of money? A place that's cold and lifeless where I can just fade away while you—" He stopped, the pain in his voice making Samuel lower his gaze. "This isn't about me. This is about you two, wanting to get rid of me." "Dad, it's not like that." Samuel tried to protest, but his voice faltered. Deep down, he knew there was some truth in what Robert was saying. "Then what is it?" Robert asked, his gaze piercing. "Tell me, what happened to those boys who loved running through these fields? Who helped their mother pick fruit in the summer?" The silence that followed was crushing. Robert sighed deeply, feeling older and more worn out than ever. The wind blew softly, carrying the familiar scent of wet soil and wildflowers. How could he leave all this behind? "Please, Dad," Anthony began, his voice softer now. "This is for your own good. The farm, it's not sustainable anymore. We can give you a more comfortable life." "Comfortable life?" Robert echoed, a bitter smile forming on his lips. "Comfort isn't what I want. I want peace. And peace is being home, here, in this place." The sound of Robert's words echoed across the quiet porch. The brothers exchanged looks, unsure of what to say. Anthony stepped back, visibly shaken but resolute in his decision. He turned and began walking toward the car, leaving his father and brother behind. "I'll be back next week with the papers, Dad. Think it over until then," he said before getting into the car and driving away, the sound of the engine slowly fading. Robert remained seated, his eyes still fixed on the horizon, his heart weighed down by the burden of what was to come. A week passed, and Robert found himself sitting alone on the same porch, staring blankly at the fields that had been his life's work. The wind rustled through the trees, carrying with it the faint echo of his son's laughter from years ago. Memories washed over him, but each one seemed tainted now, shadowed by the thought of losing everything he held dear. He heard the sound of gravel crunching under tires before he saw the car. Anthony stepped out, holding a folder thick with papers. He approached slowly, almost cautiously, as if he knew the weight of what he was about to ask. "Dad." "It's time," Anthony said softly, setting the folder on the small wooden table between them. He pulled out a pen, the metallic click of it opening, breaking the silence. "This is for the sale of the farm. It's what's best." Robert's hands trembled as he picked up the pen. He glanced at Anthony, who stood with a mixture of determination and regret on his face. Samuel, standing slightly behind, avoided his father's gaze entirely. Robert swallowed hard, the taste of bitterness and loss filling his mouth. "It's just some paper to you," Robert murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. "But to me, it's my life. Your mother's life. Our family's life." "I know, Dad, I know," Anthony replied, his voice wavering just a little. "But we can't keep it. It's too much." Robert's eyes, filled with unshed tears, darted between the fields and his sons. Everything inside him screamed to tear the papers apart, to tell them no and keep holding on. But he knew they would just keep pushing until he broke, and he was already so close to breaking. He looked down at the papers and with a deep, shuddering breath, he signed his name. One stroke of the pen, and it felt like a blade cutting through his soul. Each signature was a wound that reopened years of love and hard work. The names on the page blurred as tears welled up. "There," Robert said, letting the pen drop onto the table. He didn't bother wiping away the tears that finally spilled down his cheeks. "It's done, take it." Samuel stepped forward, reaching for the folder, but then paused. He looked at his father, truly looked at him, and for a moment, the distance between them seemed to shrink. "Dad, we'll make sure you're taken care of. We're not abandoning you," Samuel whispered, his voice breaking. Robert met his gaze, the pain in his eyes so raw it made Samuel flinch. "Maybe not," Robert said softly, "but you're taking away the only place that ever felt like home." Samuel's shoulders slumped, and he stepped back, allowing Anthony to take the folder and put it away in his briefcase. The older brother looked at Robert one last time, guilt and determination warring on his face. "We'll move you into the new place next week, Dad. It's a good facility, close to town. You'll like it." Robert said nothing. He simply nodded, his gaze drifting back to the fields. Anthony hesitated, then gave a brief, tight smile before heading back to the car. Samuel lingered for a second longer, then turned and followed his brother. The car drove away, the dust from the tires swirling in the air like ghosts of the past. Robert stayed on the porch long after the sound of the engine had faded. He looked out at the fields one last time, the sunset casting long shadows over the land. A sob escaped his lips, followed by another, until he was weeping openly, the tears streaming down his weathered cheeks. This wasn't just a sale. It was the end of a chapter, a life, a legacy. And now, all he had left was the emptiness that filled his chest and the silence of a house that no longer felt like home. The day arrived for Robert to leave the farm for the last time. The morning air was crisp and the skies were grey, as if nature itself was mourning with him. Anthony and Samuel showed up early, their expressions tight and unreadable. They tried to make small talk, but every word seemed to hang heavy in the air, weighed down by the finality of what was happening. "Are you ready, Dad?" Samuel asked gently, though he didn't meet Robert's eyes. "Ready as I'll ever be," Robert replied quietly. He cast one last look around the old farmhouse, his gaze lingering on the walls filled with photographs and memories. He reached out, his fingers brushing against a faded picture of his wife, standing proudly in front of the house with a basket full of fresh produce. She would have known what to say. She would have fought harder to keep this place, but Robert didn't have that fight left in him. So he just sighed, squared his shoulders, and picked up his small suitcase, the only thing he was taking with him. The ride to the facility was long and silent. Robert stared out the window, watching the familiar landscapes turn into unfamiliar streets. The city loomed in the distance, all concrete and steel, so different from the rolling fields and open skies he was used to. His heart ached with each passing mile. When they finally pulled up to the facility, Robert felt a cold knot form in his stomach. The building was large and modern, with a manicured lawn and a pristine facade. It looked more like a sterile office complex than a place to live. He hesitated as Anthony opened the car door, feeling his pulse quicken. "Dad, it's going to be okay," Anthony assured him, trying to sound confident. "This is a good place. They have everything you'll need." Robert forced a smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. "I know, son, I know." They walked inside, the sterile smell of disinfectant filling Robert's nostrils. The halls were wide and clean, with art on the walls that tried to add a touch of warmth. but it all felt forced and cold to him. As they passed through the lobby, a few elderly residents looked up, their eyes empty and distant. A shiver ran down Robert's spine. "Mr. Miller, welcome," a cheerful voice called out. Robert turned to see a middle-aged woman approaching, her smile bright and welcoming. "I'm Linda, the director here. We're so glad to have you. Let's get you settled in, shall we?" He nodded stiffly, glancing at his sons one last time. Samuel gave a weak smile and Anthony patted his shoulder awkwardly. "We'll come by and visit, Dad. Just get comfortable, okay?" Anthony said, but Robert could already feel the hollowness in the promise. He followed Linda down the hall, each step echoing loudly in his ears. The room she led him to was small but neat, with a bed, a dresser, and a single window overlooking a courtyard. It felt more like a hotel room than a home. She chatted away, pointing out various amenities, but Robert didn't hear much of it. His thoughts were back at the farm, imagining the sunset casting its golden light over the fields. "Is there anything I can get for you?" Linda asked, noticing his silence. Robert shook his head. "No, thank you. I think I just need a moment." "Of course. I'll be just down the hall if you need anything," she said kindly, before stepping out, leaving Robert alone. He set his suitcase down and moved to the window, staring out at the courtyard below. A few residents were gathered around a small fountain, chatting softly. He turned away, feeling the weight of the walls closing in on him. This wasn't home. This was a place where people came to be forgotten. As he sat on the edge of the bed, the door creaked open, and a soft voice broke the silence. "Hey there, new guy. You look like you could use a friend." Robert looked up to see a woman in a nurse's uniform standing in the doorway. She was older, probably in her 50s, with kind eyes and a gentle smile. "I'm Mary, one of the nurses here. Thought I'd drop by and see how you're settling in." Robert forced another smile. "I'm fine. Just need to get used to all this." Mary nodded, stepping into the room. "I get it. It's tough coming to a new place, especially one like this. But you know, it doesn't have to be all bad. We try to make it feel a little more like home here." "Home," Robert repeated softly, the word tasting bitter on his tongue. "I guess I'll have to take your word for it." Mary studied him for a moment, then pulled up a chair and sat down. "You're not alone, you know. Everyone here has a story, a place they've had to leave behind. But sometimes you find new friends who can help fill some of those empty spaces." Robert looked at her, surprised by the sincerity in her voice. For the first time since he'd arrived, he felt a flicker of something other than sadness. Maybe it was hope, or maybe it was just exhaustion, but he nodded slowly. "Maybe," he murmured. "Maybe you're right." Days turned into weeks, and Robert slowly adjusted to his new surroundings. It wasn't easy, but he found himself looking forward to Mary's visits. She always seemed to know when he needed company, dropping by with a cup of tea or a warm smile. Their conversations were simple at first, just small talk about the weather or the latest news in town. But as time passed, they began to delve deeper, sharing bits and pieces of their lives. One afternoon, as they sat by the window watching the rain patter against the glass, Mary asked the question Robert had been dreading. "Do you miss it? The farm, I mean." Robert took a deep breath, his gaze distant. "Every single day," he admitted softly. "It's not just the land, you know. It's everything. The memories, the hard work, the dreams. My wife and I, we built that place together. It was our legacy." Mary nodded, her expression sympathetic. "I get it. Losing a place like that is like losing a piece of yourself." "Yeah," Robert whispered, his voice choked with emotion. "And the boys, they didn't see it. All they saw was a piece of land that wasn't making money. But to me, it was my life." Mary reached out and gently squeezed his hand. "I'm sorry, Robert. That must have hurt more than I can imagine." He looked at her, surprised by the sincerity in her eyes. No one had ever acknowledged his pain like that. Not his sons, not the people who bought the farm. No one. In that moment, he realized how much he had come to rely on Mary's quiet presence. "You know, You're the first person to really listen, he said, his voice barely more than a whisper. To understand. Mary smiled softly. That's what friends are for, right? To listen, to care. You've been through a lot, Robert, and it's okay to miss what you've lost, but maybe there's still something left to gain. Robert looked at her, confusion creasing his brow. What do you mean? Mary hesitated, then shrugged. I just think you still have a lot to give. The people here, some of them have no one, no family, no friends. You could be that person for them. Share your stories, your experiences, help them feel less alone. Robert blinked, caught off guard. He hadn't considered that. He'd been so focused on his own pain, his own loss, that he hadn't thought about what he could offer to others. The idea stirred something inside him, something he hadn't felt in a long time. Maybe, he murmured. Maybe you're right. Mary grinned. Of course I am. And besides, I've got an idea that might help you reconnect with what you've lost. Robert tilted his head, curiosity piqued. What's that? Well, I noticed you like to talk about the farm, about your wife. How about writing it all down? Your story. I think it could be therapeutic. Robert frowned, unsure. I don't know. I'm not much of a writer. You don't have to be, Mary encouraged. Just write like you're talking to a friend. Share the memories, the struggles, the joys. You'd be surprised how much it helps to get it all out. Robert considered her words, turning them over in his mind. The idea of putting his thoughts on paper felt daunting, but there was a strange appeal to it as well. Maybe it could help him preserve what he was so afraid of losing forever. Okay, he said slowly. I'll give it a try. Mary's smile widened. Good. And who knows? Maybe one day you'll want to share it with your sons. Help them understand what the farm really meant to you. Robert's expression darkened for a moment, but then he nodded. Maybe someday. That night, alone in his room, Robert picked up a pen and a blank notebook that Mary had left for him. The first words came slowly, hesitantly, like drawing water from a well that had long gone dry. But as he wrote, the memories began to flow. He wrote about the early days, the struggles he and his wife faced, the pride they felt when they finally bought the land. He wrote about the long summer evenings spent together, watching the sun set over the fields. And he wrote about his sons, how he'd hoped the farm would be a place they could cherish, a legacy to pass on. The words poured out, filling page after page. By the time he finally put the pen down, his hand ached, but there was a lightness in his chest that hadn't been there in years. He glanced at the clock and was surprised to see that hours had passed. For the first time in a long while, he felt a small spark of hope. Maybe Mary was right. Maybe there was still something left to gain. Robert continued to write in his journal every day. It became a part of his routine, a way to channel the emotions that had been bottled up inside him for so long. Each entry brought him a little closer to understanding his own grief, and as the pages filled up, he began to see things in a new light. The pain was still there, but now there was also a sense of release, of letting go. One evening, as he sat by the window with his journal open, Robert noticed a strange tightness in his chest. It wasn't the usual ache of loss. This was different, sharp and unrelenting. He tried to breathe deeply, but the pain only intensified, spreading through his body like wildfire. Panic gripped him, and he struggled to reach the call button. When he woke up, he was in a hospital bed. The fluorescent lights above him buzzed softly, and the sterile smell of disinfectant filled his nose. He blinked, trying to remember what had happened. Slowly, the pieces came back together. The pain, the panic, and then nothing. "Hey, sleepyhead," a familiar voice called softly. Robert turned his head to see Mary sitting beside his bed, a look of relief mixed with concern on her face. What happened?" he croaked. "You had a heart attack," Mary explained gently. "It was a close call, but you're a tough old man, Robert. You pulled through." "Me?" Mary's eyes widened and she shook her head quickly. "Robert, you don't have to do that. I'm just your friend. You don't owe me anything." "It's not about owing," Robert insisted. his voice firm. "It's about recognizing what's important. You've been here for me when no one else was. You listened, you cared, you became the family I lost. I want to leave you something that shows how much that meant to me." Tears welled up in Mary's eyes, but she nodded, unable to speak. Robert turned his gaze back to the ceiling, his mind already racing with plans. "I'm going to leave the rest to a charity," he continued softly. "I want the money to go to making this place better. Better for the people here. It's not much, but it's something." Mary squeezed his hand gently, her tears spilling over. "Robert, that's beautiful. Thank you." "No," he murmured, closing his eyes. "Thank you, Mary, for everything." The process of changing his will was quick. Anthony and Samuel were notified, and their reaction was exactly what Robert had expected: shock, anger, confusion. But Robert stood firm, explaining his decision calmly. He watched as their faces twisted with disbelief, and he felt a strange sense of satisfaction. Maybe now they would finally understand. "This isn't about punishing you," Robert told them softly. "It's about teaching you what really matters. Money is just paper. But kindness, compassion, love, that's the true wealth. I hope one day you'll see that." A heart attack. The words echoed in his mind, heavy and final. He stared up at the ceiling, his thoughts swirling. He had known his health was deteriorating, but he hadn't realized just how close he was to the edge. "How long do I have?" he asked quietly, not looking at her. Mary hesitated, then reached out to take his hand. "The doctors said it could be a few months, maybe more, maybe less. It's hard to say." Robert nodded slowly, letting the reality of it sink in. So, this was it. The final chapter of his life was unfolding right before his eyes. A strange calmness settled over him as he accepted the news. He had always known this day would come, and now that it was here, he felt ready. "I want to leave something behind," he murmured, his voice steadier than he felt. "Something that matters." Mary's eyes softened. "You've already started, Robert. Your journal, your story. It's all there. But if there's anything else you want to do, I'll help you. Just say the word." Robert closed his eyes, thinking. Yes, he'd written his story, but there was one more thing he needed to do. Something that would make sure his sons understood what he'd tried to teach them all along. "I want to change my will," he said finally. "I don't want the boys to get everything. I want to leave something for you, Mary." Anthony opened his mouth to argue, but Samuel placed a hand on his arm, shaking his head. "Dad's right," he murmured. "We lost sight of what was important. Let's not lose any more." Robert's heart swelled with pride as he looked at his younger son. Maybe, just maybe, the lesson was sinking in. The papers were signed and the new will was finalized. Robert leaned back in his hospital bed, feeling an overwhelming sense of peace wash over him. It was done. Everything was in place. Now, all he had to do was wait. And as he lay there, drifting in and out of sleep, he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Contentment. Because he knew, deep down, that he was leaving behind something far more valuable than money or land. He was leaving behind a legacy of love. The day of Robert's passing came quietly. The staff at the home handled everything with a somber efficiency, and by the time Anthony and Samuel arrived, it was already over. The brothers stood side by side in the small room where their father had spent his final days, both of them struggling with the same emotion: regret. Anthony ran a hand through his hair, staring at the empty bed. "I didn't think it would end like this. I thought we'd have more time." Samuel nodded, his throat tight. "Me too." He glanced at the desk in the corner of the room where a thick journal lay, its cover worn and pages filled. "What's that?" he asked quietly. They walked over together, hesitating for a moment before Anthony picked it up and flipped it open. The handwriting was familiar but shakier than they remembered. As they read the first few pages, the words began to blur, each sentence hitting them like a wave of emotion. "I built this farm with my hands, but I built my family with my heart," Anthony read aloud, his voice breaking. "And somewhere along the way, I lost sight of that. I hope, one day, my sons will understand that the greatest legacy we can leave isn't land or money but love. Samuel swallowed hard, tears stinging his eyes. He was trying to tell us all along. Yeah, Anthony murmured, his voice barely audible. He turned the pages slowly, reading snippets here and there. Memories of the farm, of their childhood, of their mother. Each entry was like a window into their father's soul, revealing the depth of his love and the pain of their estrangement. They read in silence for what felt like hours, each word sinking in deeper, forcing them to confront the truth they had been avoiding for so long. By the time they reached the final entry, both men were crying openly. I hope my sons will remember me not for the land I gave up, but for the love I tried to show. And I hope, wherever they go in life, they carry that love with them. Anthony closed the journal gently, his hands trembling. We failed him, Sam. We let him down. No, Samuel whispered, shaking his head. He wouldn't want us to think that way. He'd want us to be better, to learn. But how? Anthony asked, his voice laced with bitterness. We can't undo what we did. Samuel took a deep breath, forcing himself to meet his brother's gaze. Maybe not. But we can honor his memory. We can start by doing what he wanted. Anthony frowned, confusion flashing across his face. What do you mean? Samuel reached into his jacket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. The will, the new one he made. He left everything to Mary and to a charity fund for this home. He wanted the money to go toward making life better for the people here, to help others, like Mary helped him. Anthony's eyes widened in shock, and for a moment, anger flickered across his face. He left it to a nurse? A place like this? Yes, Samuel said firmly, his voice steady. Because they gave him what we couldn't. Kindness, respect, and a sense of family. And he wanted us to see that, to understand. Anthony's shoulders slumped, the fight draining out of him. He looked around the small, impersonal room that had been his father's last home, and for the first time he really saw it. The worn furniture, the generic artwork on the walls, the quiet desperation that seemed to hang in the air. This was where their father had spent his final days, alone, except for the kindness of strangers. What do we do now? Anthony asked, his voice hollow. We honor his wishes, Samuel said softly. We make sure this place becomes the kind of home Dad would have wanted it to be. We use the money to make a difference to help the people here, and we support Mary like he would have. Anthony nodded slowly, the resolve forming in his eyes. Okay, we'll do it. We'll do it for him. The brothers spent the next few days working with Mary and the facility's director, learning about the needs of the residents, the improvements that could be made, and the lives that could be changed. They invested not just money, but their time and energy, turning the home into a place filled with warmth and care. They renovated the common areas, added more activities, and created a garden in the courtyard, one filled with flowers like the ones their mother used to plant at the farm. They named it Robert's Garden, a small but meaningful tribute to the man who had taught them, in his final days, what truly mattered. Standing in the middle of the garden, surrounded by the vibrant blooms and the laughter of residents enjoying the new space, Anthony and Samuel felt a sense of peace they hadn't known in years. We did it, Sam, Anthony said quietly, his gaze fixed on the plaque bearing their father's name. We finally did something right. Samuel nodded, a smile tugging at his lips. Yeah, and it's just the beginning. This place, it's Dad's legacy now. A legacy of love. They stood there for a long time, the weight of their loss mingling with the lightness of newfound purpose. And for the first time in a long time, they felt like a family again. Over the next few months, Anthony and Samuel poured themselves into transforming the home. It was more than just a project. It became a mission, a way to honor their father's memory and to atone for the time they had lost. Each day brought new challenges, but the brothers tackled them together, their bond growing stronger with each small victory. They spent hours listening to the residents' stories, learning about their lives and what they missed most. For the first time in years, Anthony found himself truly connecting with people, not just through business deals or financial transactions, but through genuine human interaction. One sunny afternoon, He and Samuel stood in the newly renovated common room, watching as a group of residents gathered for a music class they'd organized. The room was filled with laughter and the soft strumming of a guitar, a stark contrast to the quiet, almost sterile environment it had once been. "This is amazing," Anthony murmured, his eyes shining with something close to wonder. "Look at them, Sam. They're happy. Really happy." Samuel nodded, a small smile on his lips. "Yeah, it feels good, doesn't it?" "Better than good," Anthony agreed softly. He turned to his brother, his expression serious. "I've been thinking, maybe we should do more. Not just for this place, but for others like it." Samuel raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "What do you have in mind?" "I want to set up a foundation," Anthony said, the words coming out in a rush. "Something that can support homes like this all over the state. No, all over the country. Dad's money, it's not much, but with our resources, we could really make a difference." A slow smile spread across Samuel's face as he listened. "A foundation, huh? That's a big step." "I know," Anthony admitted, his voice laced with excitement. "But think about it. We could help so many people, just like we helped here. We could create more gardens like this one, fund programs to support the elderly, make sure no one has to spend their last years feeling abandoned." Samuel looked around the common room, his gaze lingering on the faces of the residents. He saw the contentment in their smiles, the light in their eyes. For the first time, he felt a sense of purpose that went beyond his career, beyond his personal goals. "Okay," he said slowly, nodding. "Let's do it. For Dad." Anthony's grin widened, and he clapped his brother on the shoulder. "For Dad." They got to work immediately, drafting plans and reaching out to contacts. Word of their project spread quickly, and soon they had other businesses, charities, and even local governments expressing interest in supporting their cause. The Robert Miller Foundation, as they named it, became a symbol of hope and change. Mary was one of the first people they hired as a board member, and her insight proved invaluable. She helped them connect with other facilities, understanding their needs and guiding the foundation's efforts. The brothers leaned on her experience and compassion, grateful for the steady presence she had become in their lives. One evening, as they reviewed plans for the next project, a complete renovation of an underfunded senior home on the outskirts of town, Mary turned to them with a thoughtful expression. "You know your father would be proud of you both," she said softly. Anthony and Samuel exchanged a look, the weight of her words settling over them like a warm blanket. They had heard variations of that sentiment many times before, but coming from Mary it meant something different. It felt real. "We just wish we'd realized it sooner," Samuel murmured. Mary nodded, understanding. "But you're here now, and what you're doing, it's more than just making up for lost time. It's creating something beautiful out of the pain. That's what your dad wanted." Anthony swallowed hard, blinking back the sudden moisture in his eyes. "Thank you, Mary, for everything." She smiled and reached out to squeeze their hands. "No, thank you. You're the ones turning his legacy into something meaningful, and because of that, so many lives will be changed." The brothers glanced at each other, a silent agreement passing between them. They had found their calling, a way to continue their father's work even after his passing. It wasn't about the money or the success. It was about making a difference, just like Robert had tried to do in his quiet, unassuming way. With each project they undertook, the Robert Miller Foundation grew. They established partnerships, built networks, and started changing the way people viewed elderly care. And through it all, they never forgot the lessons their father had taught them, not just with his words, but with his actions, his sacrifices, and his love. Standing in the center of Robert's garden one evening, watching the sun set over the flowers they had planted, Anthony and Samuel felt a peace that had eluded them for so long. "Do you think he's watching us?" Anthony asked quietly, his gaze fixed on the sky. "I hope so," Samuel replied, a soft smile tugging at his lips. "Because we're doing it for him, for everything he believed in." Anthony nodded, feeling a sense of closure that he hadn't thought possible. "Yeah, and we're just getting started." It took a full year to transform the home into a place that truly reflected their father's vision. The Robert Miller Foundation continued to thrive, spreading its influence and support to other homes and facilities across the state. People began to take notice, not just of the improvements, but of the genuine change in atmosphere, the warmth and care that now defined these places. On the anniversary of their father's passing, Anthony and Samuel decided to hold a dedication ceremony for the new wing of the home. The room buzzed with excitement as residents, staff, and community members gathered to see the changes firsthand. Flowers lined the entrance to the new section, and a plaque bearing Robert's name gleamed in the sunlight. Standing in front of the crowd, Anthony cleared his throat, glancing at Samuel beside him. His brother gave a small nod of encouragement, and Anthony took a deep breath before speaking. "Thank you all for being here today," he began, his voice steady. "A year ago, my brother and I made a promise to honor our father's memory by making this place, every place like this, a true home, a place of dignity, compassion, and community." He paused, his gaze sweeping over the audience. Our father was a man of few words, but his actions spoke louder than any speech. He believed that the real wealth of a person isn't measured by money or property, but by the love and kindness we share with others. And that's what we've tried to build here, a legacy of love in his name. Samuel stepped forward, his voice strong and clear. "We want to dedicate this new wing not just to our father, but to every person who calls this place home, to everyone who deserves to live with respect and care, surrounded by people who see them as more than just a number. This is for all of you." The audience broke into applause, and Anthony felt a swell of pride and emotion. He and Samuel stepped back as Mary took the stage, a bright smile on her face. "I had the privilege of knowing Robert Miller, and I can tell you, this is exactly what he would have wanted," she said, her voice warm and confident. "He believed in the power of kindness, and he knew that even the smallest gesture could change a life. What we've built here is proof of that belief." She gestured toward the new wing, where sunlight filtered through large windows, casting a soft glow over the room. "This space isn't just a building. It's a place where people will create new memories, find comfort, and live with dignity. And it's all because two sons decided to turn their grief into something beautiful." Anthony and Samuel exchanged a look, the unspoken understanding between them deeper than ever. They had come so far from the men they once were, men who only saw their father's farm as a financial asset, who had lost sight of what truly mattered. Now they were here, standing together, united in a purpose that transcended profit and loss. "Dad would have loved this," Anthony whispered to Samuel as the ceremony continued. "Yeah, he would have," Samuel agreed softly. "But more than that, he'd be proud of us. Proud that we finally understood what he was trying to teach us." The ceremony concluded with a ribbon cutting, and the residents were invited to tour the new wing. The space was filled with laughter and conversation as people admired the comfortable rooms, the art-lined hallways, and the garden outside, which now featured a small fountain dedicated to the memory of Robert's wife. As the day wore on, Anthony and Samuel found themselves standing alone in Robert's garden. The flowers were in full bloom, their vibrant colors painting the space with life and warmth. The brothers stood in silence for a long moment, the weight of their journey settling over them. "We did it, Sam," Anthony murmured, his voice thick with emotion. "We really did it." "Yeah," Samuel agreed, smiling softly. "We made something beautiful, just like Dad wanted." Anthony nodded, his gaze drifting to the small plaque by the fountain. "In loving memory of Robert and Elizabeth Miller," he read aloud. "May their love continue to grow and inspire all who find peace in this place." He looked at his brother, tears shining in his eyes. "You think they know? That they're together watching over us?" "I do," Samuel said, his voice filled with quiet certainty. "And I think they're smiling." They stood there side by side as the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows over the garden. The sound of the fountain bubbled softly, mingling with the gentle breeze that rustled the leaves. It was a peaceful moment, one that seemed to stretch out infinitely, filled with the unspoken understanding that they had done right by their parents. The Robert Miller Foundation continued to grow in the years that followed, expanding its reach and touching countless lives. Anthony and Samuel dedicated themselves to the work, ensuring that every project carried forward their father's vision. They traveled across the country, visiting homes and facilities, meeting people who shared their commitment to creating safe, welcoming places for the elderly. And every year, on the anniversary of Robert's passing, they returned to the home where it had all begun. They would spend the day in Robert's garden, talking, laughing, and remembering the man who had shown them that true wealth wasn't about money, but about love, compassion, and the legacy we leave behind. It was in those moments, standing amidst the flowers, the sun warm on their faces, that they felt closest to their father. And in those quiet, beautiful spaces, they knew that they had finally found their way back to what really mattered. Because in the end, love was the only legacy that truly lasted.